Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 16. Awkward. Jen didn't expect much out of the message she'd had Pierce send to Wes Green. Maybe a thank you note for identifying the language. Definitely not being stuck in the back of the rust bucket, heading to an archaeological dig site in Nevada. The good news was she wasn't alone. Pierce and Ethan had both come along. Gwen and Kevin had stayed in Bellwood to work on their problems. Jen was just glad she didn't have to deal with that anytime soon. Kevin had been much more self-conscious since the accident. She'd been talking to Azimuth about what the problem might be and finding a possible solution, but he kept putting her on hold, or telling her it was a low priority and hanging up on her altogether. She was close to just showing up at his lab and demanding he fix Kevin. It had worked for Grandpa Max when she was 11. She shook her head. She didn't want to think about that particular trip to Galvin Prime and the enemy she'd made that day. She blinked as Ethan waved a hand in front of her face. Earth to Jen. She shook her head. Sorry, I was thinking. Ethan nodded. Yeah, we got that when you stopped answering. Everything okay? Grandpa Max chuckled from his spot behind the wheel of the rust bucket. She's probably just nervous. Jen lit up red and Pierce grinned wide. Nervous? No, I'm not! Jen shouted a little too loud. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Max laughed again and shook his head at his granddaughter. Seeing an old flame can be a bit nerve-wracking. Jen glared at her grandfather. We aren't an old flame. She stood from her spot at the table and walked back to her bunk. Ethan frowned and followed her. Wanna let me in on why you're so wound up? He asked, sitting on the edge of the bed she'd flopped onto. She sighed, but eventually sat up. When I first met Kai Green, we ran into an alien that looked like a werewolf. I got bitten, and the Omnitrix used it to take a DNA sample from him. But we didn't know it did that at the time. We thought I was turning into a werewolf. Kai was really pretty and cool. She stood up for herself against tradition, but she still respects where she comes from, you know? And I had a crush. Had? Past tense. But she just liked me because I was a werewolf. Ethan nodded. So you're bi? Jen shrugged. Max spoke up from the driver's seat. A lot of plumbers use the term omni for beings who don't pick their partners based on gender or species, but I think the closest Earth term is pan. Jen nodded. Grandpa's right. He would know. Grandpa grinned slightly. Jen let out a giggle and shook her head. Pierce frowned. How so? Jen shook her head. Ask him about Grandma Verdona sometime. Or Xylene, for that matter. You know Gwen and I thought Xylene was our grandma for a while, right? Max laughed as they crossed the state line. Wes Green greeted them at the edge of the dig site. It was just outside the reservation. He grinned as Jen stepped out of the RV. It's good to see you both. Max. He hugged his old partner and smiled at the others. Jen, you've grown. You're the only one who thinks so, Mr. Green. He laughed and shook her hand. And these are? He asked, motioning to Pierce and Ethan. Max introduced them as plumbers in training, and Wes smiled. Good to see you teaching, Max. It suits you. Max smiled as Wes led them into the dig site. We were excavating an old... well, we aren't sure what it was, but it's big. And a lot of it stretches into the reservation, so the state ruled we have jurisdiction. He led them down into the tunnel and pulled a flashlight from his belt. This system of tunnels goes on for nearly 2 miles. Some of it's collapsed, but Kai and I found something interesting during the dig. He took them down a side hall into what looked like a dead end. He stepped up to the wall and pushed hard. There was a faint click, and the wall opened. The room beyond was well lit with battery lights, and sitting at one of the side walls, gently brushing off one of the tapestries, was a tall, slender Native American teenager, her hair tied back in a long black braid. She glanced up and nodded, setting down her brush. Hey, you made good time. She shook Grandpa Max's hand and turned to Jen. She looked her over, tilting her head to the side. You changed your hair. Jen ran a hand through her hair self-consciously and grinned slightly. Yeah, so what are we looking at? Kai blinked as if a bit taken aback, but nodded slightly and stepped over to the tapestry she'd been working on. We didn't want to risk taking these back to Grandpa's lab in case someone found out we had them. Jen nodded. Their reasoning was solid. This hidden passage was covered in Forever Knight symbols, a sword with the hilt replaced by an infinity symbol. Several decorative swords hung on the walls, but the tapestries were the main focus of this hall, which was long and wide, almost like the one Gregory had shown her, Gwen, and Kevin around. She frowned. Do you have a digital map of this place? Kai beat her grandfather to the punch, pulling out a plumber's badge from her belt and pulling up the map. Jen took the badge and zoomed the image out. This isn't a series of tunnels. It's a castle. Or part of one, anyway. Kai frowned. There's no way. Jen shook her head. I've been dealing with Forever Knights longer than you have. This is kind of their MO. But look. It looks like the castle was almost cut in half? She frowned as she pointed. The tunnel's there. You say they're caved in? Wes nodded. Jen tapped her chin, handing Kai back the badge. I have an alien that can get in without risking caving anything else in. I'll take a look around. Ethan, Pierce, would you mind cataloging these tapestries? Pierce was already pulling the scanning equipment from his bag. You got it, boss lady. Jen shook her head and spun the dial on the Omnitrix. She slapped it down, and green lights illuminated the hall for a moment. When it died, a blue moth-like alien stood in Jen's place. I have a hunch I want to look into. Be careful. The Knights are notorious for their booby traps. With that, she disappeared, melting through the floor before Max or Wes could stop her. They were discussing the likelihood that the structure really was an ancient Forever Knight castle. Kai stepped over to the boys, scanning the tapestries. Careful with those. Grandpa and I think they might be over 1,000 years old. Pierce nodded. Ethan shot her a calculating look, but nodded as well. Kai raised an eyebrow. She leaned against the wall near the tapestry they had sent a photo of to Max in the first place. So, you two are plumbers? In training. Pierce supplied. I got recruited by Max in the Null Void, finding an evil scientist calling himself Devoid. Ethan remained silent, so Pierce answered for him. Ethan's dad used to be a plumber, but he got sort of framed for a crime and got booted, but Ethan helped uncover the conspiracy his dad had been working to stop. Saved the world. Those chip things a while back. Kai nodded, putting her hands in her pockets. She remembered that. Her grandfather had been taken over by those chips and came at her with an antique spear until the chips had vaporized, seemingly randomly. She accidentally nudged the sword next to the tapestry and cried out in surprise as the wall behind her vanished. She slipped backward. It closed behind her in a second, leaving her tumbling through darkness. Chapter 17, Old World. Kai rolled into a somersault, arms tucked around her head to protect herself from the fall. She crashed into something wooden and grunted in pain, but managed to stand mostly intact. Just a few splinters here and there. She pulled a flashlight from her belt and flicked it on as her badge began to beep. She pulled it out with her free hand. I'm okay. She answered the call, and her grandfather let out a breath. Good. The mechanism is stuck. We may be able to jimmy it open on our side, but it's risky. It could cause a tunnel collapse. Kai shook her head. No, I'll find my way out on my own. Max Tennyson's voice came over the comm in her badge. I'm sending Jen to help you. She should be there in a moment. As he spoke, frost rimmed part of the floor and Jen's alien form rose through the brickwork. Yep, Moth Girl is here. A heavy sigh sounded through the insectoid mouth. Big chill, Jen muttered as she wrapped her wings around herself like a cloak. Kai grinned slightly. We'll figure a way out. Jen leaned closer, cold breath whispering along Kai's arm. I found something deeper in. I'll take Kai to check it out before we head back up. Before Wes could speak, Max's voice sounded again. Sounds good. Keep an eye out for other traps. Jen nodded, and green lights flashed as she turned back to normal. Kai glanced at her as she pulled a small bag off her shoulder. Where does that go when you transform? Jen shrugged. No idea. She rummaged for a moment before she pulled out what looked like a glow stick. She cracked it and shook it. It lit up bright, illuminating the hallway like it was an actual light bulb. Kai flicked off her flashlight. Handy. Jen nodded and stepped over to the boxes Kai had crashed into. She brushed the moldering wood off the contents. Armor, she pointed out. Kai nodded. It was rusted, and some of it had completely fallen apart, just piles of red rust, but the larger pieces were still identifiable. Jen frowned and brushed at the rust on one of the breastplates. There's another symbol here, some kind of circle, but it's too damaged to make out what it is. Kai nodded. You said you found something? Jen nodded, shaking her head as she stepped down the hall. Yeah, come on. They made their way down 2 flights of winding stairs. Kai frowned. This is almost like a tower. I think you were right. This was a castle. Jen nodded. I'm right a lot more than people give me credit for. Jen snipped, and Kai frowned. She remembered Jen being a lot more friendly last time they'd seen each other. Did I do something? Kai asked. You seem really tense. Jen glanced over her shoulder, then shrugged. Guess I'm just untamable. That comment slapped Kai in the face with the realization that maybe she and Jen hadn't exactly parted on the best of terms. She was silent for a moment. Look, Jen, I'm sorry. We were kids. She fell silent again as Jen shook her head. No, I get it. We were kids, but I'm not a toy. Kai nodded. I know that. I'm sorry. Jen paused on the stairs and nodded, looking back at Kai. Apology accepted. Kai smiled and held out her hand to Jen. She took it and shook it once. Come on, it's just up ahead. Jen led her off the stairs and down a short hall before turning into a large room. It looked like it might have been a library at one point, but the majority of the books and scrolls had rotted, not leaving much behind but a bad smell. In the center of the room, though, was something very out of place. An energy dome sat covered in dust, but still active. Kai stared. How? Jen shrugged. No idea. The Knights have always been good at stealing alien tech and even sometimes figuring out how to use it. That's what I was looking for. Sometimes they're more dangerous traps or automatons, alien tech that's hard to take down in close quarters. I didn't find any of that. Actually, this is the only piece of alien tech I could find. The fact that it's still working is pretty impressive. Kai nodded, pulling her brush from her belt. You're not wrong. She made to brush off the dome, but it flared and Jen pulled her back as dust flared into small flames, leaving both girls coughing from the smoke for a moment. Jen waved it away and looked over the dome. She frowned. It was clear now, and beneath it were 2 perfectly preserved books. The one on top was simple leather embossed with the Forever Knight sigil. The other was under the first, but was bound in green leather. They were standing on a perfectly preserved table, carved to appear as though the legs were the Forever Knight's sword. But this one was slightly different. This one had the same circular symbol on the hilt that the breastplate upstairs had. Jen blinked and stepped closer to the table. That's not... Kai was frowning too. It looks like it is. They exchanged a glance before looking back at the circular symbol. Inside the circle sat an hourglass. It looked like someone had carved a plumber's badge into the wood. That can't be coincidence, Kai said, shaking her head. Jen nodded. Same Galvan writing on 2 Forever Knight tapestries, now plumber symbols? No way is that coincidence. Any ideas how to bust this open? Kai pulled some tools from the pouches on her belt. She circled the dome for a moment before frowning. Projector's inside. I can't get at it. Jen leaned forward and frowned as she ran her hand through her hair. Maybe we can move the whole thing? Maybe Big Chill can freeze it solid first. She let her hand fall back to her side. The Omnitrix came close to the field, and the dome flared again before flashing green and vanishing. Jen stepped back in shock and blinked down at her wrist. What? Kai shook her head. How did you do that? Jen shook her head. I wish I knew. Jen stepped to the table and picked up the book on top. She blinked as she spotted the book beneath. It, too, had the plumber's symbol on it, though this was carefully embossed to be even more eerily accurate than the one on the table. She slipped the first book into her bag without looking at it too closely and picked up the second one. There was a click, and Jen swore under her breath as cracks began to open and water began to flood into the room. Jen spotted a glowing symbol on the wall as she shoved the book into her bag. Jen reached under the table and snatched up the dome projector. Kai grabbed her arm, and both girls ran for the stairs as water began to rapidly rise. Ethan frowned as he scanned the last tapestry that wasn't buried under rubble. It had been a while since Kai had fallen through the wall and Jen had gone after her. They hadn't called back on comms since, but that was pretty usual for Jen. She didn't tend to check in unless there was a real emergency, which was why he frowned when his badge beeped. He answered quickly. "Ethan speaking." "Ethan, get everyone out. Get everyone out of the tunnels, now." Ethan turned to the others, but they were staring at the wall of rubble behind him. He turned and looked down as water leaked out of the cracks between the rocks. "What about you?" Ethan demanded as Pierce grabbed his arm and dragged him out of the hall as Max and Wes began to call for the evacuation of the rest of the tunnels. "I can get us out. Just go." The call cut off, and Ethan turned and joined the others as they raced out of the ruins and back to the surface. Ethan looked back at the site as water bubbled out of the tunnels. "Everyone else is out," Wes called out as he counted heads. Max pointed out at the site as a small section of ground began to smoke before melting apart and disgorging green goop and Kai, who gasped for air. She was soaked, but otherwise unhurt. The goo coalesced into a human-esque form and flashed green, leaving Jen behind, also soaked. She grabbed for her bag and pulled it open. "They're dry!" she cried out in triumph. Kai laughed and held up her hand for a high five. Jen obliged, and they both laughed as Wes shook his head. "What happened?" "Booby trap," Jen explained, pulling 2 books out of her bag.